This tutorial is going to show you the basics of watercolor. First, we're going to set up our workspace and our palette. You can see here I have my water cup, I have my watercolor tubes. Make sure it's watercolor, not acrylic or water mixable oil. I have several paper towels and a few different size brushes. And here's my palette, and I actually put water right onto the palette itself. Here's my pigment. You only need a little teeny tiny bit, like the size of a ladybug. So when we use watercolor, we're not using this paint straight as it is. We have to mix it with the water. That's actually not paint, it's pigment. We don't want it to look like that. We need to take it and dilute it with water. It's like if you're making Kool-Aid, you don't drink just the straight up powder, you mix the powder with water and that's what you end up drinking. Same thing with watercolor. We mix the pigment with the water and that's our workable paint. The more water I use, the lighter wash I get. I can also kind of blend my edges out. Our first technique is called wet on wet. You can either start with plain water like I'm doing here, and take a little of the watercolor and kind of float it in. This works really well for skies and clouds and things like that. Or you can also start with a base color and float some different colors into it. Just be careful you don't overmix it while it's wet because you'll just end up with mud, unless that's what you want. If you can't get saturated enough, you can dry off your brush and go back and put some more saturated colors in. Our next technique is wet on dry. So I have two shapes here that have been drying for about 5 minutes. I know they're dry to the touch. I can also check by tilting my paper. Shouldn't be shiny if it's dry. On the top here, I'm going to take a little bit of that same color and just define, not over the whole shape, but just kind of on one side. And this will help it to give it a little more dimension, a little more form, make it look not so flat. You can even go in with a little more of the same color, just right on the edge, to really make it look like it's 3D. Or I can even do some texture over the top. I don't want to cover the whole thing, but just some of it, so it kind of gives it a little bit of a feeling. Almost looks like maybe shrubbery or a tree or even a green rock. Now here's the same idea, but I'm using a different color. When I do this, I want to stick with colors that are in a similar family. So this is kind of a turquoise green. And then I'll use a blue because that's also a cool color that works in that color scheme. And I could use on the edge even just a tiny little bit of black, but you want to be careful. Use that sparingly because a little black goes a long way. Our next technique is called hard edge. So I have some shapes that I painted here. I know they're dry. I brought them right up to the edge of my pencil drawing, not shiny. And what I'm going to do is take some different colors and paint them in the blank spots, but I don't want to go over the paint that I've already placed down there. We have to make sure that it's dry when we're doing this, otherwise the edges will bleed together and we won't get a hard edge. We'll get an edge that's kind of bleeding and blending. Our next technique is called masking or resist. So here I have some painter's tape that I've laid down in just kind of a different design with some triangles and things like that, and I'm going to paint a wash over it. I'm going to choose to use a couple different colors. Don't let them over blend together again or you'll get kind of just a mush of brown mud. Now here on this second area I have some crayon that I've laid down there. You couldn't see it until I went over it, but that was white crayon. This crayon has a little color to it, so it shows up a little bit differently. I can dab up with the paper towel so the wax kind of shows through a little more. This is what's called Frisket. It's sort of a liquid rubber, and you can lay it down with a paintbrush. It's slightly orange so you can see where you're putting it. And then once it dries, you can paint right over it. It takes maybe 5 minutes to dry. And it will mask off areas where you don't want paint. Now here's the fun part, is peeling everything off. You can go back into it with, you know, some line work, even a little other light wash to kind of do some layering. We don't need to touch the crayon. The frisket just peels right off with your fingers. Our next technique is texturizing. So I have two little scenes that I've laid down that are dried. So let's say I want to make this water look like it has some ripply texture to it instead of just a flat band. I can do these little kind of wiggly lines. Remember to make them smaller and closer together as you would get further back in space to show distance. I don't have to use a paintbrush though to make texture. In this case, I've crumpled up a little piece of paper towel and I'm dabbing it right into my watercolor to make some texture. You can do different saturations. You can fold over your paper towel if it's getting a little too dark. You can use lots of different things to make texture. Our next technique, we're going to work back into our work with some drawing media. So let's say you've got something, just needs a little bit more definition to it though. You can use an implement like a pencil to kind of go over and outline a little bit, give a little texture. Same thing with a Sharpie pen. We don't want to overdo it. We still want it to be a watercolor piece, but we can give just a little something extra to it by adding in these additional multimedia. We can use colored pencils. Just make sure that it's colored pencil because the watercolor pencil and the colored pencil look similar. And I'm not going over the whole thing. I'm just going over a little bit just to give it that little something. Now that colored pencil, if we go over it with water, it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to stay in place. But these watercolor pencils, which make sure you read it, it actually is a watercolor pencil. They lay down just like colored pencil, so you can kind of put them down the same way. And if you go back in with a wet brush and go over them, then you can get kind of a washy effect. So they're cool because they're sort of drawing, sort of painting. And the last technique is to use a white gel pen to create some highlights. Now we're going to add in some other ingredients into our watercolor. The first one's rubbing alcohol. So I pour it into a little cup, or in this case the cap, just so it's easier to work with. And I take a little dropper. You can also drip it with a paintbrush, just be careful. And look at that, it makes little bubbles when it drops into the wet watercolor. It's got to be wet, it can't be dry. So if I get another wash here, and a little bit of table salt, and sprinkle it in and let that dry, and then wash it out over the garbage can once it dries, it kind of gives a little bit of a texture. This kind didn't work super well. Now we're going to put all these techniques, or most of them, together in a time lapse. So first I'm laying down sort of a resist and doing a wash over it. A little rubbing alcohol. Let it dry for about 5 minutes. Gonna peel it off. Working back in with a little more resist with the frisket and also some crayon. Let the frisket dry for a couple minutes. Go over it with a very light wash. Let that dry. I'm gonna kind of define my shapes a little more. It's hard to see, but I had the basic outline. I was thinking of kind of like an organic, almost like flower shape, but I wanted it to be a little more abstract. I didn't really have too much in mind. I was just kind of going with it. Again, let that dry. Now I'm working back in with some complementary colors, some cooler colors to kind of offset those warm pinks and yellows that I had. And again, let that dry for a couple minutes. And then lastly, I'm going to do just a little bit of a definition with a Sharpie pen. Just kind of makes it come out more, and a little teeny tiny bit of color pencil and gel pen. And that's how it came out. Kind of experimental. Since each wash takes a few minutes to dry, it's a good idea to be working on several pieces at once. I didn't work on this all sequentially, but I jumped around to make good use of my time. Watercolor is versatile, both washy and bold, controlled and expressive. By trying out some of these techniques, you'll be creating awesome work in no time.